This is Saeed on All Streams Radio. If you've just joined us, we've been speaking with tonight's guest, author, activist, linguist, Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky will take you to a different subject here, WikiLeaks, in terms of the cables that have reverberated from around the world. What is, in your opinion, if you could take us continent by continent, and I'd like to focus this time on North Africa and the Middle East, in terms of the disconnect between, or the American foreign policy interaction with North Africa and the Middle East, and what has, according to some people, has indirectly triggered the uprising that took place in Tunisia?
Well, the WikiLeaks have been interesting in that respect. Among the leaks that have been publicized are cables from the U.S. ambassador in Tunisia. I happen to have some of the wording in front of me, so I'll quote from it. He described Tunisia as a police state with little freedom of expression or association and serious human rights problems, which is a bit of an understatement. And he did also go on to describe the ambassador, I think it was, I've forgotten who it was, the ambassador described extreme corruption in the hands of the ruling family and, basically robbery of the population, which means that Washington knew what was going on. I should say, in extenuation of the U.S., that the European record is far worse.
Yes.
France is the most guilty party. It had enormous influence in Tunisia, its former colony, and it knew exactly what was going on. But it continued to support the dictatorship. Europe went along with it, the loans and so on. But all of them, all the West understood, the governments understood that this was a corrupt and brutal dictatorship. But they continued to support it because it was in line with Western policies. It was preventing Islamist participation in the political process. It was cooperating what is rather ludicrously called the war on terror. Good investment opportunities, a lot of tourism, okay by Western values. Meanwhile, it was a horror story, and they knew it. And the explosion, when it took place, came as a surprise. They thought the government had a lid on it, but that's pretty standard. That typically, for example, in the case of Iran, the U.S. government, which was the main supporter of the Shah, couldn't have been unaware of the brutality, corruption, torture. All they had to do was read Amnesty International reports. But they didn't pay attention. In fact, Carter, who was then president, was near the end, praising the Shah of Iran because his people loved him so much and so on. When the uprising took place and overthrew the government, it was again a surprise because of the standard assumption that our favorite dictators can keep the lid on. It was incidentally the same in Haiti in 1986. And many other countries, Marcos in the Philippines, Ceausescu in Romania was another U.S.-British darling, and on and on.
So it appears to be that from all the reports I read about Tunisia, they kind of missed the mark. Some of them gave the interpretation that the Islamists are the one behind this revolution, or also that the Tunisians have the uprising because of shortages, economic problems, as a result of raising the prices. I'm thinking that probably this has taken place further along in history rather than just all of a sudden. It's been a brewing problem for a long, long time. Don't you think, Professor?
Not only that, but it's a brewing problem all over the region. Similar things are taking place in Algeria. Libya's could blow up. Egypt is one of the worst cases. Egypt is a really brutal dictatorship. A huge poverty amidst extreme wealth, the torture, terror, suppression of any opposition. And once again, the U.S. strongly supports it. You may recall that on his way to Cairo to deliver his famous so-called reconciliation speech, Obama did have a press conference, and he was asked by some member of the press whether he would say anything about what they called Mubarak's authoritarian regime, President Mubarak's authoritarian regime, which is quite an understatement. And Obama answered that, almost quoting him, he said, I don't like to use labels for folks, so I'm not going to describe him as authoritarian. He's a good person. He's trying to do good for the country. He's keeping it stable, and he's a helpful ally. Well, how anyone in the Middle East could have taken Obama's pronouncements about human rights seriously after that is pretty amazing. Actually, they did for a while, although now antagonism to the United States has grown so high among the population that, according to the latest Western polls, just released a couple of months ago, about something like 80% of the population regards the United States as the biggest threat to the region, little less than Israel, which is 88%. 10% regard Iran as the major threat, and antagonism to U.S. policy is so extreme that a majority, I think it was 57%, say that the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons to deter the U.S. and Israel. Actually, that tells you something interesting, again, about WikiLeaks. One of probably the most publicity that the WikiLeaks disclosures have revealed, that have gained, is headlines all over the place about how the Arab states support the United States against Iran. And there are various quotes, authentic or not, from Arab leaders about how, you have to attack Iran and so on. And there was much euphoria about how the Arabs support us. Unmentioned was Arab public opinion, which is what I just described. I mean, that reveals a degree of contempt for democracy, which is quite spectacular, not just on the part of the diplomatic service, where you expect it, and the State Department, but also on the part of commentators. I didn't see a reference to the results about Arab public opinion. If the ruling dictators support us, everything's fine. If the public overwhelmingly opposes us, that doesn't matter, because our dictator friends can keep them under control, like Tunisia.
Yeah, in the case of Tunisia, though, their anger is not directed at any country, maybe somewhat towards France, but nevertheless not directly towards the U.S. But also, the question is, do you see the prospects of revolutions taking place in the surrounding area now that people are more open to the outside world? Do you see the prospects for that, or do you think that Tunisia is just an isolated case?
Well, if you read the press in the Arab world, what you're just raising is a major theme in all the countries of the region. The dictators who we in Europe support are worried, and the narrow elites whose needs they serve are also worried. They're worried that it might spread. The West so far is maintaining its confidence that the dictators can keep everything under control. That's been the standard position for decades. I shouldn't mention, just so we can have a little historical background, that there's nothing new about this. I mean, back in the 1950s, President Eisenhower raised with his staff, this is all secret then, it's been declassified, the question of why there's what he called a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world. And then he said, not among the leaders, they're supportive, but among the population. And the National Security Council, the leading planning agency, had in fact just released a major study about this, in which they said that, again, I'm virtually quoting, they said that there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh and brutal regimes and blocks democracy and development. And we do this because we want to ensure control over their oil supplies. And then it went on to say that this perception is pretty accurate, and in fact that's what we should be doing. That's the 1950s, and it's persisted. It's not, as occasionally said, that they hate our freedom. What they hate is our support for dictatorship, our barring of democracy and development, and our contempt for the public as long as they can be kept under control.